horseshoe crab blood has long helped us make safe medicines. Now, alternatives that spare the ancient creatures might be breaking through. An enzyme in the blue blood has been key to testing vaccines since the 1980s, raising concerns for the crab's population. But regulatory approval and new data are signaling the tide may be turning. A horseshoe crab on the sand. Horseshoe crabs evolved 445 million years ago and have been around for 1,500 times longer than Homo sapiens. It was not until the 20th century, however, that scientists discovered life-saving properties in their blood. Todd Rosenberg/Eli Lilly and Company. Mary Randolph, staff contributor. October 24, 2025. Get our newsletter. Each May, hundreds of thousands of horseshoe crabs climb onto beaches along the eastern coast of the United States. An invertebrates love island, males compete to procreate with the largest females. The hum of scampering claws and tapping shells fills miles of beach. The American horseshoe crab is not the most glamorous or endearing animal. With its long, spiky tail, helmet-shaped shell and 10 eyes, the 445-million-year-old species did not get this far relying on its good looks. But in this annual event, called a mass spawning, the crabs leave behind tens of thousands of eggs, which contribute to a wider ecosystem along the eastern seaboard and allow the ancient species to continue thriving. It's the most magical natural phenomenon, says Will Harlan, who acts as the Southeast Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. He took his kids to witness a horseshoe crab mass spawning in Delaware last spring. Usually, his children are glued to their screens, says Harlan, but that night, they couldn't look away from the sea of crabs scuttling ashore under a full moon. Fun fact, horseshoe crabs aren't really crabs. Despite their name, horseshoe crabs are not crabs or crustaceans, they're chelicerates, more closely related to spiders and scorpions. Since the 1980s, humans have prized horseshoe crabs for another reason. The invertebrates' light blue blood has likely benefited anyone who has ever received a vaccine or flu shot. Equipped with a system that detects toxins as soon as they enter the crab's bloodstream, the blood is a key ingredient in a product that can detect contaminants in medicines. Pharmaceutical companies use the mechanism to ensure their drugs are safe. But amid concerns for the horseshoe crab population, conservationists, biotechnology experts, and drug manufacturers alike have spent decades pushing for the adoption of synthetic alternatives that don't harm the animal. This spring, that effort reached a new milestone. For the first time, the industry's primary regulatory body, the U.S. Pharmacopeia, officially recognized the alternatives as an option for companies to test vaccines. Now, 11 major pharmaceutical companies have reported an initial shift or intent to shift to these alternatives in a survey conducted by conservation groups. And the biggest producer of the blood-derived product publicly backed the crabless alternatives this summer. Harlan says his organization, which worked on the survey of the pharmaceutical companies, hopes to see all 50 of the largest companies by profit shift to these alternatives. But it might not be a rapid transition, as making that change involves navigating an intricate network of corporations and regulatory bodies. Around the time Harlan took his kids to Delaware Bay, Alan Bergenson took the day off work to visit another beach and flip horseshoe crabs that had gotten stuck on their backs during the spawning, a tradition he's had since he was 3 years old. This small act can save the invertebrates from an immobile death sentence on the shores of the bay, he says. Bergenson has spent his career in biotechnology researching, advising and working on the horseshoe crab blood tests and alternatives. Jay Bolden, too, traveled to Delaware Bay last spring as part of a meeting of leaders in the pharmaceutical industry. Bolden spearheaded the first widespread shift to the crabless alternatives in the U.S. at Eli Lilly, where he works as a senior director and biologist. He and his peers at other companies spent several days learning about these alternatives, discussing the possibilities for their respective companies and seeing the crabs in action. His beach day, he says, was gratifying. A lot of the time, people don't think beyond the four walls of the lab, he says. But to make that connection, to see it and hear it and smell it, is really cool. Harlan, Bergenson, and Bolden share a deep love for the species and its natural ecosystem. Although they approach the issue from different worlds, conservation, biotechnology, and pharmaceuticals, they all say the new, crabless alternatives are the future. But that future has long faced regulatory roadblocks, conflicting research and an extremely cautious pharmaceutical industry. Horseshoe crabs predate dinosaurs. Can they survive us? A bunch of horseshoe crabs along the waterline at the beach during spawning. Each spring, horseshoe crabs fill beaches along the eastern seaboard in what's called a mass spawning. Will Harlan, Southeast Director for the Center for Biological Diversity, calls the event the most magical natural phenomenon. Todd Rosenberg/Eli Lilly and Company. Larry Niles still remembers a time when it was unimaginable that anything could happen to the horseshoe crab population, because the animals were so abundant. As a species, the creatures have been on Earth 1,500 times longer than Homo sapiens. Surely, people thought, we couldn't do that much damage. Now, Niles is co-director of the Horseshoe Crab Recovery Coalition, an alliance of 50-plus member organizations that use science, policy, and public communication to protect the species from endangerment. The coalition includes Harlan's organization, the Center for Biological Diversity, which does advocacy for horseshoe crab conservation across industries. Most areas don't have specific population counts, but Niles says the American horseshoe crab along the East Coast has seen a decline due to biomedical bleeding and the use of crabs as bait in the fishing industry. The species is described as vulnerable by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. 3 other horseshoe crab species exist today, dwelling off the coasts of South Asia and Southeast Asia, where fewer fishing and bleeding regulations exist. One of those 3 species is designated as endangered. The others are considered data deficient. To create the highly desired product that can test for toxins in medicine, called Limulus amoebicite lysate, or LAL, fishermen catch horseshoe crabs and bring them to bleeding facilities. There, scientists drain up to 30% of each crab's blood before returning them to the water. Drawing crab's blood isn't necessarily lethal, and several studies have found an approximately 15% mortality rate in the bleeding process. But Niles' camp believes that even if crabs don't die, the process can impact their breeding patterns and abilities, thus harming their population and the wider ecosystem. In a 2022 study in the journal Aquatic Conservation, Niles and others found horseshoe crab egg populations were 1/10 as dense on Delaware Bay beaches than they were 30 years ago, pointing toward the pharmaceutical and fishing industries as the cause. Conservationists emphasize that this decline can affect more than just the crabs. Migrating shorebirds rely on the crab eggs as food during their journey. One such bird, the red knot, was declared threatened in 2015, yet the industries kept using the crabs that fed them. Everybody's after their individual part, and nobody cares about the whole, Niles says.